Welcome to another edition of North Penn Answers. This program is brought to you by the North Penn School District to address the community's questions and concerns. My name is Josie Charnock, and I am a member of the Board of School Directors. It is prime budget season in North Penn School District. On February 10th, the school approved the 2015-16 preliminary budget. This is the first posting of next year's budget, and there is a lot of work to do before final approval. On today's program, we'll be talking with the Finance Committee and members of our Business Administration Department. Joining me now is Steve Skrocki, Director of Business Administration, and Brian Pawling, the Assistant Director of Business Administration. Steve has been with the school district for about a year now. Steve, can you tell us your background in finance and what you were doing before joining us?
Certainly. First off, thank you for having me on the program this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
You bet. It's hard to believe, considering I'm only 35 years of age, but this is actually my 23rd year in school business altogether.
Wow.
Most recently, I worked at Upper Marion Area School District, which is located in King of Prussia, Montgomery County. I was there for about 4 years. And prior to that, I was in Lancaster County for about 16 years with the school district there as a chief financial officer. But I'm certainly pleased and happy and honored to be an employee of North Penn School District as a Director of Business Administration.
Great. And what was the financial health of the school district when you began here?
Great question. North Penn is actually in a very positive financial situation. I basically tend to look at an outside organization and have them do an evaluation of the school district finances. And we actually have that happen on a regular basis through an organization called Moody's. This is an organization, it's a credit rating organization, and they put a rating on the school district every time we go out and do a bond issue. A bond issue is for borrowing money for a construction project.
Which we did just recently.
We did just recently, absolutely. About 2-3 weeks ago for the Hatfield Elementary School project.
Yes.
But Moody's is really important because instead of Steve Skrocki saying, hey, the finances are great at North Penn School District, let's take a look at an independent source. And these are experts, nationwide company that does this for a lot of high-profile organizations. So when we did the bond issue for Hatfield, and we've done bond issues in the past, Moody's assigns a rating on our bond issue. And that's really a rating based on the financial health of the school district. So the higher the rating, the better the financial health. And it's an alphabetical system, if you will. The highest rating you can get is a AAA, which is really outstanding. But North Penn does have an outstanding rating, and that rating has actually improved over the last 5 or 6 years. So most recently with the Hatfield Elementary School borrowing, not only did our rating stay the same, which is a good thing, but we got upgraded, if you will, a mini upgrade, if you will, to a positive outlook by Moody's. So that's basically a recognition of the fact that the school district does have positive reserves held on hand, cash reserves. That's called a fund balance, or a rainy day fund, as some people refer to it as. So all told, the school district has about $38 million in reserves on hand. So we do have a large budget, so it's really important to have reserves on hand to help mitigate future tax increases or to survive any economic downturns that might occur. A good example of that was a recession that occurred about 4 or 5 years ago when that started. The school district had enough reserves on hand to ride out that recession. So the positive ratings that we have from Moody's is really a reflection of the fact that we do have a very, very positive financial situation in North Penn. And that was one of the things that was attractive to me in coming to North Penn.
And Brian, you joined last spring. Tell us about your financial background.
Well, like Steve, I'm also in my mid-30s, and I've been working in school district finance since 2001, since I graduated from college. I spent 12 years at school districts in Chester County, and most recently I was the assistant business manager at Manheim Township School District in Lancaster County before coming here this past June.
So you also have a hefty background in finance.
Yes.
In school finances. That's fantastic. So, Steve, in terms of the budget process, can you speak to that a little bit, and then what is required by the state?
The budget process that we have is actually a 3-phase process. And it starts with phase 1 being the preliminary budget adoption. And that actually, as you mentioned earlier, occurred last evening. The school board, by a 9-0 vote, approved a preliminary budget for the 2015-16 fiscal year for the North Penn School District. So that's really phase 1. And what we do between now and phase 2, which will occur in May, we continually refine the budget. So the way we view things, the preliminary budget is nothing more than a beginning. It's really that first step. We get all the information we have at the time, put it together, but we know that many things will change between now and May. And May is the second phase of the budget process. That's when we put forth what's called a proposed final budget. The board will also act on that budget. And then we move to phase 3 in July, which is the final budget. At that point in time, the school board will set the tax rate, also known as the millage rate, for the 2015-16 year. And that's important to many people because the millage rate, that's what determines what the taxes individual households pay, what businesses, corporations pay for the upcoming year. So many people pay attention to the final budget perhaps more than the first 2 phases. But we do finish off the final budget in June. It has to be passed by law by June 30th. We have that scheduled for the school board action meeting in June. And then we need to submit all of our documentation to the Pennsylvania Department of Education to ensure that we were in compliance with each of the 3 phases.
And I know prior to even the budget that was passed or approved yesterday, there's a lot of internal work that happens. Brian, can you speak to what happens, those steps before that process even takes place?
Yeah, really we start the process for the preliminary budget in November. We get some dates from the Department of Education, and we build an internal timeline of the process that we're going to go through leading up to June, where we pass the final budget. So after we get that established, we start to set up meetings in early December. So this year, Steve and I visited all of the school administrators at their buildings to sit down and talk to them about what they saw was pressing issues or things that they wanted to address in their budget for the upcoming year. And then we also spent time meeting with every central office administrator to go through their budget requests for the upcoming year. So once we have those meetings, and it's important for us to get feedback from those people, we take that information back, and then through the rest of December and in January, we put together the information that we get from those departments. We work on some of the internal numbers, especially on the revenue side of the budget, using past year's actual numbers and some projections that we see will be coming in for the upcoming year. And January is really the time where we put together the final pieces of the proposed budget, and then we have some other things to do, like getting it into the required format that the state wants us to file, which is called the PDE 2028 form. So
a lot involved.
Yes. So going through, I think there's over 9,000 single expenditure lines in the budget that we need to go through, and so there's a lot of work getting all of that put together and then getting it into the format that the state requires, and then getting presentations ready for the board and for the internal departments to review also.
And Brian is amazing because he knows all 9,000 account
I'm
codes
sure
by
he
heart.
does.
That was a test that we gave him about 2 weeks after he started.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
So let's hone in a little bit on the revenue estimates. How are they determined in creating that preliminary budget, especially given that we don't know what the state's going to do at this point?
great question. I think we'll show a slide too for the audience, a breakdown of our main components of our revenue. Our revenue is really one side of the equation of the budget. You have your revenue, that's the money that comes in, and you have your expenditures, that's the money that gets spent, that goes out. So for the revenues, there's really 3 main pieces of revenue for North Penn School District. We have what's called local sources, and I'll explain that in a second. Local revenue, that's about 72% of the total revenue pie. About 17% of the revenue comes from state sources, and about 1% comes from federal sources, so a very small amount from the federal government. But so those 3 components, we do have to look at each 3 component when we put together the revenue side of the equation. So for local sources, for example, the biggest piece of the pie for local sources is local real estate taxes. That represents a lion's share of our revenue coming into the school district. And that's really not a complex formula. It's really easily determined because we take a look at all the values of the properties in the North Penn School District. That's called the assessed values. We add all those up, and that basically gives you what's called your tax base. All the properties' values added together is a tax base for the school district. And then we take a look at the tax rate, the millage rate. We multiply those 2 together, and that determines what the total possible revenue could be that we could bring in for real estate taxes. Now, we understand that each year there are some individuals that are unable to pay their taxes in a timely manner. So there's typically maybe a 3% that don't pay their taxes. So we typically collect about 90% of all taxes that are levied. And that's the figure that we use then for the budget.
97?
About 97%.
Okay, I
Yep.
thought you said 90%. I
No,
got a
about
little
97,
worried.
no. 97%, and that's the figure then we plug into the budget. We expect to collect 97%. So that process is not that difficult because the numbers for the tax base, the assessed values, we don't have to calculate that. That comes from Montgomery County Board of Assessment and the Bucks County Board of Assessment, since our school district does encompass both counties.
Right.
We receive the numbers from the county departments and we apply the tax rate and then assume 3% won't be collected, and voila, we have our budget figures for the local real estate taxes. So that's the biggest piece of the pie, there's no question. So that's pretty easy to determine that piece. That's not too difficult. We have numbers that we can put in right now that's pretty solid. When we get into some other areas, like we have an earned income tax, the EIT tax, also known as the wage tax. Many of our residents will take note on their paychecks. They have 1% deducted from their paycheck for the wage tax. Well, half of that 1% comes to the North Penn School District, and that's a big share of revenue that comes in for the school district. Next year, for example, we're projecting about $15 million in earned income tax coming to the school district. So that's a big piece of our revenue pie. Now, for that, we get out our crystal ball because, quite frankly, to be able to predict how much money we'll collect on the wage tax is something that's more of an art than it is a science. We do take a look at economic trends, what's happening in the overall economy with wage growth. We take a look at our wage tax collector. There's a contracted collector that collects that on behalf of all school districts in Montgomery County. We ask for their crystal ball, their projections. But really, we take a look at the trends that have occurred over the last year or 2 years. That's really the primary force, I believe, that drives out our prediction for the earned income tax. So the real estate tax, pretty easy. Earned income tax, more of an art, not the science. But put those two together, those two alone are the lion's share of our local revenue. Now, moving on to the state revenue, a smaller percent of our overall revenue budget, 17%. We don't have any information right now for our state budget figures, but quite frankly, there's really only two main sources of state revenue that we don't know about. They're basically set through the legislation each year, through the governor's budget that's approved by the legislators. Those two pieces are the basic instructional subsidy and the special education subsidy. Those are two big pieces of state revenue. We have no information on what those numbers are going to be for next year. So what we do for the preliminary budget, we simply assume those numbers will be the same.
Right.
We assume that we'll receive no increase. We know one thing, those numbers won't go down. Okay, so we can at least be guaranteed by putting in a 0% increase that we're not going to end up with a number that's worse than that. Then when the governor presents his budget, Governor Wolf will present his first look at his budget in early March. Whatever numbers that he proposes for individual school districts, we'll update our numbers and we'll use those numbers. And if they change between now and June, we'll continuously update those numbers. Some other sources of our state revenue include transportation subsidy, reimbursement for our pension obligation. Those numbers are all driven by a formula. So we pretty much know what those numbers are going to be. They're driven by some of our expenditure figures. So all said and told, actually creating the revenue budget, in my opinion, is a lot easier than creating the expense side of the budget, even though many of our revenue items are pretty much known and pretty much set in stone. I think it's fairly easy to put a revenue budget together.
Got it. Thank you. And speaking of the expenditure side, what would you say are the biggest stressors on the budget?
That's another great question. We talked about this at the preliminary budget adoption last night. And the main focus, and we'll show a slide for the audience for this, is the pension obligation. Okay, the pension obligation is also known as PSERS, P-S-E-R-S. It stands for the Pennsylvania Public School Employee Retirement System. And North Penn is not unique in this major budget challenge. Every school district in the Commonwealth is faced with this. And Josie, the way this works for PSERS is simply this. For every dollar we pay in salaries, we're required by law to pay a certain percent into this pension fund, into the PSERS fund. And we have no choice in what that percentage is going to be. We have no choice in the matter. We basically are told to pay in that percent, and we have to comply with that. Now, that pension number has dramatically increased over the last couple of years and has put an incredible stress on the North Penn budget. So, for example, back in 2010-11, North Penn had to pay in about 5.5% of all the salaries into the pension fund, 5.5%. Now, for North Penn, that 5.5% represented about $6 million. So it's a lot of money. We have a
It is.
big budget here. Our current year budget is $227 million, and most of that comes from salaries. So 5.64% was the actual percent, and that was about $6.1 million in pension. So fast forward to the 15-16 preliminary budget. We're going from 5.64% all the way up to 25.84%.
Wow.
That is an absolutely incredible change over that period of time, and will represent about a $24 million increase to the North Penn budget in a mere 6-year period from 2010 to the 15-16 year. That's added to the budget. And we talked last night, it really adds nothing to the instructional program. It's not like we're hiring new teachers. It's not like we're providing an enhanced curriculum. It's the same people doing the same job for the children, yet we're required to put in an extra $24 million compared to 6 years ago. So that is the biggest stressor.
Relief in sight
No
as
relief
far
in
as the eye
sight.
can see.
And we have another chart for that showing that although we're at 25.84% next year, that number will continue to grow to a peak of around 32%. So 32 cents of every dollar in salaries we pay will go out the door for pension obligation. So you hear many school districts say that we have uncontrollable expenses. And I hear that statement and I say, you know what, maybe there's some truth to that in this regard because the rate is set by the state. We have to pay in our share. I would say I would agree that this piece of our budget is an uncontrollable expense. We have no say in the matter. We have to pay in what we're told to pay. So next year's budget, $30 million total out of our budget next year will be dedicated to nothing but the pension obligation.
Right. And that 30% that you refer to will stay flatline for next 20 years.
Yes,
right?
yes. The PSERS fund and then the state employee retirement system, the SERS fund for state employees, those two pension funds combined have a deficit right now of about $60 billion. So in order to get those funds back to an appropriate funding level, it's going to require our employer share to go up, I think it's around 32%, and it'll stay around 32% for a number of years, about 20 years. Now, if the stock market goes up 200% a year, maybe that number will change because the pension fund does invest in some equities. So maybe if we have a booming stock market, that number will come down a little bit. But unfortunately, it's not going to go back to the 1% that it was back in the year 2001. So imagine that, going from a 1% employer share all the way up to 26% this coming year, knowing that it's going to go to 32% in a few years. It's just mind-boggling. It really is. The amount of additional money that's generated in the budget solely because of pension obligations. So that clearly, in my view, is the number one stressor on the budget. But another thing we need to talk about in the budget are charter school costs. Okay, the charter school costs, and we have a chart for this as well. We do have 2 pending charter school applications in the school district. And as a result of that, we added $1.8 million to the budget next year for charter school expenses. So the way charter schools work is this. If a student resides within North Penn School District and elects to attend a charter school or a cyber school, we basically have to pay a tuition rate to those charter or cyber schools. Again, something that's required by law. We have no say in the matter. We have to do it. There's a different rate for regular education children. There's a different rate for special education children. But we're kind of using a blended rate of about $15,000.
Okay.
So for every North Penn student that attends a charter school, it's about $15,000. So what that means is if these 2 charters are granted and they begin operations next year, which is a possibility, we suspect that there could be upwards of 120 students that attend these charter schools, new students that aren't in charter schools now. Mind you, we do spend well over $1 million already on charter schools. This $1.8 million that I referenced earlier would be new money added to the budget in addition. So it doesn't have any impact on children that attend North Penn. Again, doesn't enhance the instructional program for children at North Penn. School choice is part of the law. So North Penn is paying the tuition rate for those students that are attending the charter school. So we're fearful that we could have a major impact on our budget, not only next year, but in future years, because if these 2 charter schools, the new schools, expand at the rate they think they're going to expand at, in a mere 3-4 years, that $1.8 million in the budget could be upwards of $5-6 million in the budget. So those are 2 major increases in the budget that, again, to a large degree are completely beyond the control of anyone at North Penn School District, but nonetheless will be adding millions of dollars to the North Penn budget.
So you had mentioned, Steve, about Act 1. Could you, Brian, talk a little bit more about Act 1 and how it affects the budgeting process?
Yeah, so in 2006, the state legislature passed Act 1. What Act 1 does is it sets a annual percentage limit that we can increase our budget by. So since 2006, the highest percentage that we've been able to increase our budget has been around 4.4%. For the current 14-15 school year, our Act 1 index amount was 2.1%. For the 15-16 budget, it would be 1.9%. So basically what that says is we can't increase our millage rate from the 2014-15 year to the 15-16 year by more than 1.9%.
Right.
So with that, when you look at the amount of money that we can generate from those funds, and then you look at the expenses that we have just in the retirement alone, there's not nearly enough to cover those required expenses that we have even with the Act 1 index. The state does allow us to apply for what are called exceptions to that. So there are certain categories. The two that we normally file for here at North Penn are for special education expenses and for expenses related to the PSERS increase. So those two amounts that we could increase our budget by for the 15-16 school year would be about $2.4 million. So even with a 1.9% increase into the preliminary budget that we proposed, we're looking at a $6.7 million deficit. So if you would take the additional 2.4 off of that, we still have a sizable difference in the budget. So Act 1 is something that we have to abide by. We have the exceptions, but you can see it limits us, especially with the required expenses that Steve just talked about that are increasing faster than the amount of Act 1. So, and Act 1 is really tied to some economic indicators. So if the economy improves, we should see the Act 1 index increase, but there's a lag on that. So when we see the increase,
kind of reactive.
Correct. Yeah. So if what we're looking at with the 1.9%, with the economy trending slightly upward now, we might not see the advantages of that in the Act 1 index for another year or two.
Given all those stressors, how has North Penn been able to stay at or below the state index?
One good thing I think about the Act 1 index, it forced school districts to become more efficient. You might hear some arguments that, oh, well, we're limited to the Act 1 index, we can only raise taxes so much. I say, you know what, that's a good thing. I've seen school districts over the years, since 2006, become more efficient. They had no choice. They were forced to become more efficient. And that's one of the things that has happened at North Penn. I think we are very efficient. We look under every rock, every area where we can possibly increase our revenues through creative ways, through advertising, through assessment appeals, whatever the case might be, we take a look at that possibility. Also, on the expenditure side, I know North Penn is living with vacancies, meaning that if you rewind to several years ago, there are approximately 150 positions in the school district that over the years have not been filled. So that's a reality at North Penn, that those positions that were previously funded could not be funded due to the budgetary restraints. So that's probably the best example in terms of scaling back and becoming more efficient, lean and mean, so to speak. And North Penn is in the same camp as other school districts. You were forced to do that. So that's the one benefit of the Act 1 index and limitations. Other things we do is we take a look at some of our large contracts. For example, our healthcare contract. Through contract negotiations, labor negotiations, we try to implement healthcare plans that will be less costly for the taxpayers of the school district. And in our two most recent labor agreements that were ratified by the board recently, our Teachers Association and our Support Staff Association, we were able to implement new healthcare plans that reduced our overall expense by about 5%. So that's another good thing. So in the face of growing healthcare expenses, typically rising 3 times or 4 times the rate of inflation, we were able to have a 5% reduction in our healthcare costs by implementing new plans, new plan designs. So that's another area. And I also referenced contract negotiations. That's another area. Anytime we have our labor agreements come up, or any other contract for that matter that comes up, our goal is to try to provide a very cost-effective contract that keeps in mind the taxpayers of the community in the economic circumstances that we're in at this point in time. The other component that we take a look at is to balance the budget is the use of our reserves. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Our reserves, again, are called our fund balance, F-U-N-D, fund balance, rainy day fund. So it's basically the money that has been accumulated over the years, and that money can be drawn down, can be used up to balance a budget if there's not enough money to pay the pension obligation, as an example. So we do have $38 million total in our overall fund balance. Some of that money is specifically earmarked for the pension increases. So that's one thing we spoke with the Finance Committee, as you know, since you're on the Finance Committee, about a strategy to start using some of the pension money that's been set aside to help reduce the impact on our budget moving forward. But one of the things I know that Brian and I look at every day, if there's anything we can do to drive more money to the instructional program and maybe save money on the non-instructional program where it doesn't impact the students. We take a look at all of our ancillary services. That could be from transportation, becoming more efficient in our transportation runs and routes. That's taking a look at doing healthcare eligibility audits of our employees. We have over 1,600 people covered on our healthcare plan and a number of dependents to make sure everybody's actually eligible for the healthcare coverage. To taking a look at all of our internal operations to see if we can do any process more efficiently and hence hopefully save some money, negotiate contracts, anything we can possibly do. So the no stone unturned motto really does apply every day to us.
Brian, speaking of those budgetary reserves, can you go a little bit in more detail about what those buckets are and what the intention of those buckets are?
When we go through the budget process, we try to anticipate as many things as possible. It's our job to go through that and try to be prognosticators and say, okay, well, we want to make sure that we're covering every expense that we know about or we can anticipate. But sometimes there are things that we can't anticipate or things just maybe...
Crystal ball isn't very clear.
Yeah, sometimes it's not 100%. It's kind of like the weather. But so we do build in some budgetary reserves into the budget each year. So for the upcoming school year, for 15-16, we have $1 million, which is less than 0.5% of our total budget. It's a small amount, but that's for things that we can't anticipate in the budget. So, for example, we have the budget passed in June, the final budget for the year, but we have a large enrollment increase at the end of the summer. And because of our class size ratios, we may need to hire additional staff. Budgetary reserve could be used to cover those unanticipated expenses. Or we could have a large piece of equipment that breaks that's essential to the district that we couldn't see that it was coming, and we may need to repair that or replace that piece of equipment. So we try to build that money in, but be responsible as part of the overall budget to say, what's a fair amount to include for these unanticipated, and we go back and look at prior years and things that, again, goes back to the anticipation of what we can kind of see what may be coming up.
So it sounds like you're constantly busy, constantly refining the budget. Tell us about the department, the people that you work with to
we
make
are
this
constantly
happen.
busy. When you tell someone that you work for a school district, their first comment is, oh, you must be off for the summer, right? Well, I can tell you in the business office in particular, it's nonstop year-round. We're very busy over the summer. In fact, possibly more busy in the summer than other points of the year because we have auditors that come in and take a look at our financials during the summertime. But in terms of other departments, the business office actually kind of oversees a number of our support services departments. For example, I would oversee all the food service departments, school nutrition services, the facilities department. That would include all of our custodial, maintenance, and ground staff. Also, the transportation department is overseen by myself. And any kind of construction projects also would be under the auspices of the business office. Plus, we have a staff that works directly in the business office doing accounting work and financial work for us. Healthcare benefits also would be another area that goes through the business office. So really, when you take a look at support services, it's pretty much all support services in the school district run through my office as a director of business administration. The instructional services handled, of course, by the superintendent and assistant superintendent and the individuals that work with them. But on the non-instructional side, most of that does run through our office one way or the other.
You've been here a little while now. Overall, what's your impression of the North Penn staff, the students, the community? What's your sense of this district?
I'm really impressed. One of the things that I'm most impressed with the North Penn staff is just the dedication of the employees. Clearly, the employees are our biggest asset. I think an organization is basically effective if it has effective employees. And we obviously do a good job at hiring here at North Penn. And everyone that I've come in contact with so far, my first year at North Penn, has been a very positive experience. Dedicated staff that have the children's education at the forefront of their minds. So everybody is driven to try to produce results for the students. And clearly the students produce results, because when you take a look at the test scores and so forth at North Penn School District, I'm proud to say and be affiliated with North Penn because we are a very high-performing school district, yet we don't spend a lot of money relative to our peers.
Right.
So you can easily say that you get a really good bang for your buck here at North Penn with respect to the education compared to a lot of our peers, not only in Montgomery County, but throughout the state. So I'm really proud to be affiliated with an organization that's that dedicated to make sure that we have high student performance.
Well, thank you both for being here and joining me. And it sounds like there's a lot of work still ahead, so I'll leave you to your work.
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank
it.
Thank you. Up next, board members from our Finance Committee, Frank O'Donnell and Corey Brown, will join us to discuss the 2015-16 budget process. Stay tuned.
Together, we can end the stigma of mental health and break the silence.
Can I sit with you? Do you really think you're gonna be able to fit in here, honey? Who would ever date someone like that?
Do you think he's ever worked out before in his
What
life?
a wuss.
Even I could beat him up.
So skinny. Hey, you can sit with me.
Guys, seriously? Hey, sorry about my friends. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Welcome back. Joining me now is North Penn School Board members Frank O'Donnell and Corey Brown. Welcome, Frank and Corey. Frank, Corey, and I all are on the Finance Committee together. The Finance Committee meets at 6:30 p.m. on the last Monday of every month. It is a public meeting where all members of the community are invited to participate in discussion on monthly revenue expense reports, enterprise fund statements, capital projects, fund balance, and investment reports, just to name a few areas. Corey is the chairperson of the committee and has been a board member since last July. Corey, can you tell us what your experience has been like since joining the school board?
Actually, it's been a pretty steep learning curve. I think there's been a lot of new material to go through. There's been a lot of different things to learn, but it's been a really excellent opportunity. I think I've been very excited. I've had lots of energy, and being around other people with that energy and a passion for the school system has just been awesome. I've really appreciated it.
Part of that committee, when someone attends from the public, what did they expect to see? What is it, the experience like sitting at a committee meeting?
Well, I think it's actually, if they've gone to an action meeting before, I think it's a lot more informal. I think that it's an opportunity where people from the community and the audience really have an opportunity to ask questions and really engage us. And at the same time, we're often asking questions and really learning and trying to make sure that we understand all the details. So I think that it gives us an opportunity to really dig into new details that we may not have been familiar with in the past. And really start to get a better understanding. And to second what Frank has said, Brian and Stephen have just been fantastic and been capable of really coaching me along and understanding a lot of the different details and the ins and outs. And
so Frank, as a board member, veteran board member for 18 years, you touched on this a little bit now. What are the things you've put in place to allow for more transparency in the process?
Actually, it's 17. I'm in my 18th year. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember when it took place. When Vince and I came on 17 years ago, 17 and a half years ago, I believe Donna Mango was board president. And I don't remember, it was either Vince or Donna Mango. Somehow, within a couple of years, we created the committee process. Because at that time, I remember attending some board meetings that they went to midnight.
Very lengthy.
They went to midnight. And we were told that what happened imagine without a committee, that every finance issue, every ECP issue, support services, now those committee names are new, but imagine all of those items coming in front of the board, the business manager. So they just went on, there was information discussion going back and forth, and you would leave 11:30, 12. I'm told at one time during the budget process that Bobby was telling me that there was like, within 2 months, it'd be like 4, 5, 6 meetings that would go till 1 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, my goodness.
So now we created the committee process. So it's our job. So when something new comes before us, we hash it out. If we don't, as a committee, we don't have enough information, we send it back. We come back again, and when we're finally ready for it, he seeks a motion, and when we approve that motion, then it goes to a work session or the action meeting. This way, the rest of the board counts on finance for our recommendations, support services, ECP, or safe schools. So that way, I remember the first time many years ago, I think we had one board meeting, it was only 45 minutes because all the committees had done their homework. And that was just awesome.
And having a committee, you can really dig into the details because you're not thinking, oh my goodness, I've been here for hours, Don't ask these specific questions where, in fact, you can get into the details.
Exactly. For example, we just saw at a recent finance committee where the director of before and after school came to us about increasing prices. Well, for the summer school program and before and after school. Well, what they do is they do a separate P&L, a separate profit and loss statement. We call them enterprise funds. We look at that. And sometimes if they're making a profit, when they recommend an increase, I think last time, a few weeks ago or whatever, there was only a 2% recommended increase because financially we're doing well in that area. We manage our funds. Plus one of the other things is about North Penn is we don't have to pay ourselves overhead where the other organizations do. We look at, in that case, 7 or 8 different other organizations when we compare prices and we come up with price increases. But that's what we do. We look at their financial statements, and if we say everything's fine, they say 2%, that's fine with me as far as I'm concerned. If we see losses, we're hoping the director will say, well, maybe we should add another % or 2 more in there. But for example, Margie, who runs our before and after school, she's been our one and only director so far for 15 years, and she's just doing a phenomenal job. I can't say enough about our superintendent, our business director, assistant business director, Steve and Brian, our personnel. We really have a great group of people that keep the board straight to help us out.
So Corey, can you share with us what a typical finance committee, how that would run or typically runs?
Sure. When we would start a meeting, we would open it up for any comment from the audience. After that, we would go through just sort of an informational gathering period where we review the finances for the school. After that, we would move on to any items that we'd be interested in moving to a work session or an action meeting. And then ultimately, if through that we haven't caught everything, we usually take one more pass on it and pick up any other new business or interesting business, and then we can typically adjourn for the night.
Even prior to the meeting, we're looking at those reports, the documents ahead of time, so we can ask the business administration the questions, you know, that we may have, and that is shared across all the school board members so that they, even though they're not on the committee, they can also see what's going on.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of those documents are made available to us as committee people a few hours, a couple days earlier, and we've had an opportunity to really look through them and hopefully dig and had our chance to find any questions that may be of interest to us.
Yes, we go through them, and it's important we go through, as you just said, so we can come up with our questions, because in some cases where we have an outside speaker come, for example, the annual audit, when we had Ed Furman from Mailing Falconero come in, we knew that was going to take a little bit of time. So the business director will simply say, do the three of you guys have any questions? We'll say we've been through it, or it can wait, or I've already sent you an email beforehand and I get something where it would be the questions like an immaterial type thing. So this way we allow for an outside person to go first. Then we may go back in and answer one or two of those questions,
Right.
if we have any.
Right. So typically there are about 12 reports that are created as a result of, you know, the different aspects or components. Can you talk to us about that?
Actually, I did a count right before we started this. There's actually 13.
Yeah, I came up with 13 too.
Off by one.
I was wondering which one was off.
As I said earlier, we have a good business director and assistant director, and they do their job. They go through, they dot the I's and cross the T's. But as board members, it's our responsibility. If there's an oops, we're the ones replaced, not them. So these reports are critical. It also tells us when we start to see something go wrong. One of the first reports we created a long time ago, I call it a cash flow report, but on there it has revenue, expenses, and assets. I basically look at the bottom line at the end of the year. It's a monthly report. We compare it against the budget, and right now we're $3.2 million ahead. The first 3, 4, 5 months of the school year, I don't worry about it too much because it depends on when money comes in. But now I'm starting to watch closely, because there was twice before, many years ago, when the revenue wasn't materialized on the earned income tax or the real estate taxes, or something happened, that what we did, the board, the finance committee, said to the superintendent and the board president, hey, the revenue's not there, so we put a freeze on spending. So that's why we watch that.
We need to keep track, yes.
And we also keep in mind that our fund balance, you know, this also has the fund balance, and that's extremely important to have a reasonable fund balance, not too much, not too little, in case there's an oops. And
Well, we can't exceed 8%
well,
anyway.
the budget must be under 8%, as you say. And for example, next year, it's projected to be, I think, 7.6%, which is about 17.5 million of the budget. That's fine. And some people say, why do you have $17 million? Well, we're now self-insured. So we had to take some of this money in the past and put $3.5 million out there, because we have insurance, we're self-insured, but that extra money is for what is not covered. So we have to have money out there for that. We also need money for our capital reserve. That was mentioned in the very beginning. You know, for those smaller projects, not for like the school district where I say school district like Hatfield Elementary, where we're borrowing $15 million, $10 million at a shot for the major projects. But we need money to do those small projects. For example, when you get Pennbrook needs a new school,
Yeah.
a new roof, you're talking about $1 million. And that's a lot. So that's what we need that money for. So we've managed to be a very wise district. We managed, the Finance Committee, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking credit for that. we take credit for that because we watch our funds and then we make the recommendation to the board president or to the rest of the board or the superintendent on how we proceed. And right now, we're doing fine.
I want to go back to a point you had mentioned, Corey, about moving things to work session or action meeting. Can you tell us what the distinction is and why some go to work session and some go to action?
Oh, sure. The items are typically divided up by how routine they are. So, and whether they actually need additional explanation to the rest of the board members. So if there's something that we really want to talk about, for example, like the budget, then by all means we would take that to the work session. But if you've got something routine, like just trying to make sure the accounts balance and we're actually moving money between the various accounts, that may go directly to an action meeting.
Budgetary transfers,
Budget
things like
transfers,
that. There's a lot of
exactly.
routine things that doesn't require the entire public, you're transferring money from here to here within the department.
Right.
That they're immaterial type things. It's the major things, as you just said, the budget, the audit.
Yep.
Other than that, I can't think of many things the Finance Committee has. It's the material
That we
things.
typically take to work sessions.
Right,
Yep.
Yeah.
right.
Absolutely.
Okay. So last night we passed the preliminary budget. This is clearly not the final budget. In terms of what the board is looking for to see what the final budget should be and what to pass, what specifically does the board look for?
I think what's going to happen is it's not going to change too much. The only thing that will really change, there's only a few items that will change. What the public probably doesn't know, we created the revenue, the real estate taxes should bring in, of our $237 million, should bring in $169.7 million. That's based on like a $7 billion assessments of the North Penn School District.
Right.
We use the January data. But what will happen is for the final budget, we use April. So we've seen where within those few months, sometimes May, depending on how fast we get the information from the county, we may see an additional increase of $500,000, $1 million more in taxes that we will get. We also, right now, being the budget was prepared basically in January, and we approved it last night, the preliminary budget, it had to be done for the state, Form 2028. But I think it was mentioned last night that the governor does his preliminary budget sometime in
Early March.
middle of March,
Yeah.
something like
Yep.
that. So, and we've been down that road too. They say you get X amount of dollars, all of a sudden the final budget comes down on, and it's no. What do you mean no? So that's what we have to watch in doing so.
Yes.
Also, some of the other things that can happen is they say, oh, you're going to get this much state, this much federal. What's happened to us in years past for some of these reimbursement rates, the state decides mid-year to cut the formula.
What's the difference or what effect has Act 1 done to the budget process?
It's hard to follow up on what Steve and our business director and Brian said. Basically, the Act 1 of the year 2006 was put in place. It's a combination of two state indexes. They added this percent increase, this percent increase. They add them, divide by 2, and they said, this is the maximum you can increase. So it with a couple of exceptions, which you heard Brian talk about. But it basically said school districts in the past, there's 500 school districts. So in the past, school districts would say, oh, we want to go 8%. Oh, we want to go 10%. And they would just do that. By putting the brakes on that, it also puts the brakes on all of our expenses as well as contracts. So they're not getting out of hand. Because other school districts, as of the 500 school districts, the process was simply getting out of hand. So the Act 1 index passed by the state legislature in 2006 is slowing everybody down. And I think it's done a darn good job.
So Corey, from your standpoint, what are the biggest budget challenges we're facing, not just in this school district, but across the school districts?
Sure. From the earlier conversation, I think that Stephen really went in and summarized those pretty well. But to revisit, the first one is really the PACERS fund, which is the the teacher's employee retirement fund. And then the second piece with that, really quick behind it, is the healthcare associated with it as well. Both of them are growing at an unbelievable rate. And when you just look at PACERS alone, when you take into Act 1, what just boggles my mind is one moment the state will say, hey, here's the maximum amount you can increase taxes for the year, and then they'll send us a bill, and the bill for the retirement fund is actually in excess to the amount they actually allowed us to go up.
1.9, that the state says, you're right, you can't raise taxes by 1 point, you can only raise taxes by 1.9. However, here's a 6% increase.
Yep.
6.5% increase.
That's
What do
exactly
you do?
right.
So the state legislature back in 2001 dumped that on the 500 school districts. And that is frustrating for all of us.
Yeah. So every year is another expense cutting year. There's no doubt in it. With $6 million that came out of the PACERS, 1.9% of the amount that we can raise taxes at the moment will only account for about 3 of that. The good news is that the state is actually going to pay part of that bill, but at the end of the day, it still doesn't actually meet the tab.
So we touched on budgetary reserve before, and there's some misconception about what that could be used for. You know, some have the impression that, oh, we can just fill in any gaps with that money in the budgetary reserve. But can you talk about, Corey, why this isn't a good fiscal practice?
Yeah, actually, this is one of my favorites, and I was very involved with the Lansdale area and talking about this too, and how you really set a decent tax rate and how you figure out what it is that you should actually be using a reserve for, and when you should actually be figuring out, hey, this is actually what the cost of running the facility really is, and we need to be paying that bill on a routine basis. It's one thing that anytime you can actually identify it as something of a one-time fee or a one-time cost, that's when you can really use a surplus or that sort of budgetary holdback rainy day fund. But if you start actually applying the rainy day fund to something that's actually going to be a recurring fee, but even worse, if it's going to be a reoccurring and increasing fee, that's the worst time to do it, because today it may be $1 you owe, tomorrow it's $2 you owe, and you can handle the first 5 days of that, but by the 6th day, they now ask you for the $6 bill. Everybody's blown away by where did that come from, and you've really kind of masked a problem that's been growing over time. And we really need to set ourselves up that we can actually run the ship full-time and permanently, even though there may be projects here and there to fix up the fronts of the new schools or different, like I said, one-time moments to invest in.
Most of those items, at one time, years back, our budgetary reserve was $6.5 million. And then we've slowly brought it down because we've gotten tighter, as you say, we've gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. So the $1 million budgetary reserve is just for those one-time things that you just described.
That's right.
Yeah.
There is so much to discuss concerning the Finance Committee, as you've seen here, and we could have had an entire show dedicated to the nuances of our capital projects, enterprise funds, and bond financing. But before we go, why is it that both of you personally dedicate your time and energy to be a board member, and why are you proud to be part of the North Penn School District?
I'm proud to be part of the board. Not only just because I'm part of the community and it's where I live, and I think that it's one of our responsibilities to do anything we can to give back, but that I've got 2 children in the North Penn School District as well. So I look forward, they're both young, and I look forward to being involved throughout their lives, and hopefully for many years after that.
I'm a detail guy. I used to be a controller for many years. My last 7 years of working, I'm retired now, but I was a CFO, and I'm the guy, kind of a guy that gets into the detail. I get into the detail a lot. I just enjoy doing that. It's what I do. To each his own. We have some people who don't. I do that. As Corey said, I feel it's my community responsibility to do this. I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy getting their input. It's a discussion for another day, but I was out of the school today and got a lot of input on some things that eventually I'll be bringing between the Finance Committee and or Support Services. But it's something I just love doing. To each his own. I love being on North Penn School Board.
I do as well, and I have to say for me personally, education has changed my life for the better, and I want to give back, and this is the way I feel I can, and I'm very passionate about educating our children, and I know you guys are as well. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Josie. Thanks,
Thank
Ray.
you.
That's it for this edition of North Penn Answers. I hope this episode has been informative. If you have questions you'd like to see answered on this show, please email northpennanswers@npenn.org, post questions in our Say What section of the website, or ask in person. We encourage all members of the community, parents, teachers, students, anyone who wants North Penn to continue to be one of the top school districts in Pennsylvania, to send in your questions. Thank you and have a good night.